mentioned how the Shah was working on modernizing Iran and equality between females and males. And I read that one of the reasons why the Islamic or the White Revolution occurred is because the Shah was working on a policy that said that women should not wear hijab. And now Iran also, like, women have to wear hijab. So I think the key for modernizing is not to have this. So what do you think? Can you explain?
Well, first of all, it is not true that the policy of the regime was one to force women to forcefully remove the veil. Absolutely not. It was purely their choice. What was defended was their right to have that choice, which was not tolerated by the clergy. There's a big difference right there. This regime imposes the hijab, almost reducing women as a, second-class citizen, literally, in terms of their legal rights, in terms of their stature in society. And this is what is far beyond. The damage is not just the appearance, but as a result of which, what is the status of women today as opposed to where it was going back then? The hijab was not at all an issue. I mean, you would roam the streets of Tehran or Isfahan or Shiraz, or even in the villages, you would see women who would be not wearing it and some women who would be wearing it. The only thing that, even before my father continued, it was started at the time of my grandfather, is in order to set the example, he asked the members of his own family not to wear the hijab as a symbol of daring and not be afraid of not wearing the hijab if you don't want to as a woman. It started with that. So it is not true that back then it was imposed on women not to wear the hijab. It was their choice. Whereas under this regime they are forced to wear it whether they like it or not.
What do you feel would be the outcome of a non-violent civil uprising or civil demonstration with the regime's recent nuclear developments and the threats that have been made?
Well, first of all, the nuclear agenda of the regime may be one issue that has been the focus of many foreign governments. I promise you, the nuclear issue is the last thing on people's mind as far as Iranian people are concerned. They want freedom, they want opportunity, they want better living conditions. The economy is in shambles. It is not our national priority. The regime is hiding behind what could come across as a nationalistic issue by claiming that, well, we ought to be nuclear. After all, Israel has nuclear weapons, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, why not us? So what we're talking about in the change of regime is what is the problem with this regime as a whole, far more to the interests of the Iranian people because of their circumstances, that whatever this current regime represents as a threat to regional countries or the world community. So yes, it's by bringing down this regime, you also eliminate whatever threat that this regime is associated with, including the nuclear threat. Because I don't think Iran could ever be a country that would pose any threat as a democracy. Democracies don't go to war against each other. I haven't seen an example where two democratic countries have actually gone to war, save perhaps the Falkland Islands, and maybe that's also debatable. But I mean, it's very, very rare in the annals of history where democratic countries go to war at one another. So in that sense, and since you brought the nuclear issue, I will explain to you a little bit my rationale why it is that I would say as an Iranian, it is not in my country's interest to become a nuclear power in a military sense. Number one, I would argue that Iran in the region has a natural strategic advantage vis-a-vis its neighbors in terms of its human resources, natural resources, an advantage that we would lose vis-a-vis our neighbors if we were to commit to a nuclear arsenal, because then they will also establish the same, and as such there will be an equalizing factor at which point we would use that natural advantage. It simply doesn't make sense. Number two, I would argue, at the time of the Cold War, this was part of the debate. As a matter of fact, when Iran started looking at nuclear energy, it all started because my father always believed that oil is too precious a commodity to be used only as a fossil fuel, as opposed to its derivative, petrochemical, and we could have better use for oil and try to find other sources to create more energy for electricity and what have you. And at the time, there were only 3 viable technologies. One was gas turbines, who at the time were not efficient enough, quite polluting, and expensive technology. We looked at that, didn't make much sense. Solar energy at the time was very much in its trial and infancy, certainly not as far as it has advanced today. That was also not going to be cost effective. The next best technology, which will be more cost effective, would have been nuclear, which is why Iran signed the NPT, and as a result, we became 10% shareholders of a consortium in Europe called Eurodif, which was going to furnish Iran with its nuclear fuel for the 2 reactors of Bushehr that were supposed to come online back in 1982. At the time where the nuclear program in Iran started, some of our nuclear scientists went to my father and asked him, well, we know Pakistan is developing it, should we consider the military option of having a nuclear arsenal? My father's answer was very practical. He said, look, even if we had a few dozen missiles, we cannot stop 3,000 Soviet missiles. What was the threat to Iran at the time? It was the Soviet Union and its thousands of missiles. What could we have done to prevent that? The only other state of belligerence that Iran had to some extent was, in fact, with the very famous or infamous Saddam Hussein, who we managed to contain through conventional military capabilities, at least until the time of the revolution. Pakistan, India, the dispute over Kashmir is an issue that is much more concerning them without any geostrategic interest of any form. Israel was never any threat to us as a state or even as the Jewish nation. If anything, Cyrus the Great 25 centuries before helped the Jews rebuild their temples, and in a way save Israel. I think the Jews owe their existence to Persia of back then. And in modern days, I don't think you will find any element of animosity by the people. The regime is different, mind you. The regime is something else, but not the people. So there was no justification for us to do that. Third, I would argue same thing that I said to you earlier. Would I really want to have a dozen countries in my immediate neighborhood, non-democratic countries, potentially having a missile point at Tehran? Would I sleep better as an Iranian at night? That doesn't make sense either. Number 4, the cost of maintaining a nuclear arsenal is very much prohibitive for countries that need so much more in their development and their progress that it simply doesn't make sense. And at the end of the day, I will revert back to, if there is going to be a regional element of stability and cooperation, why not share the pot with the other countries and allocate something that could be like what NATO has, a regional arrangements with all these countries. So instead of gearing up militarily, watching each other from across the border, in fact be under the same umbrella. So instead of facing each other, our backs are to each other for any other potential threat that could be out there. For all of these reasons, I don't see in what way we could justify why Iran should or could become a military power. This is my personal opinion. Now, what policy the future democratic government in Iran might take, I don't know, but I will argue the same argument that I just gave you now, then, if I'm still alive. So, you were talking about the civil disobedience. Yes, I think the civil disobedience will take care of the change, which could also lead to a complete rethinking of what this regime, unfortunately, is causing in terms of threat and concern for the region above, which will be immediately eradicated as a result of that change. So in fact, I think rather than wasting your time negotiating with this regime to change its behavior or its comportment, it's better to help the people get completely rid of this regime and then let them stand there and say, you know, we are not at war with our neighbors. We are not here to export an ideology. We simply want to have a better life, better opportunities, and in an environment of peace and stability and mutual respect. That can happen, but there has to be a complete change of policy. The incentive is back home there, I think the Iranian people have demonstrated many times that are willing to come to the streets even with the least bit of help or support. Imagine what they could do if they knew that this time they actually have serious support behind them. So yes, I think it could certainly work in that direction.
One of the methods proposed by many Western governments to help combat religious extremism in theocracies is to increase education in those regions. I was wondering whether or not you agreed with this, and if you did, if you had any suggestions as to what they should do to go about it, as it seems it would be in the best interest of the current regimes to oppose it.
No, education at all times is good. At all times. It's the #1 priority that should be on anybody's mind. If you ask me, my trio of first thing that I would do for a country, I would say education, communication, transport. You give people the means to educate themselves, to communicate with each other, and have means to move about goods or themselves. These are the key ingredients. You give them this infrastructure, the rest they can take care of it themselves. The problem with education is that it takes time to develop if you are faced with an immediate problem that needs a short-term solution. In other words, you don't have time to educate people for a task that has to happen now. It's good for the mid-term to long-term. But how do you do something when you don't have time to let them, through education, become aware of various capabilities or potentials? I think the only way to expedite that is by communication. In other words, much more broadcast of information via media, it's satellite broadcast, it's radio, anything that the other side is trying to keep people from hearing. So when you don't have the time to educate an entire generation because something has to happen within the next 2 or 3 years, the only way to make them at least aware of it is to certainly give them a heavy dose of information. Education will have to be there, but you should not rely only, what I'm trying to say, on education. It's always good to have education at all times, as I said. But when you want to achieve a result a bit sooner, you cannot just rely on education. You have to also pump them constantly with information and facts. So it's a more rapid way for people to become conscious and aware of the potential that they can achieve. And people have common sense. They're not stupid. I mean, even with almost nothing, they were able to take different initiatives. Case in point, again, this whole phenomenon of the so-called Arab Spring from Yemen all the way to Morocco. We've seen all sorts of different actions taken by people who were not necessarily, quote-unquote, educated in the true academic sense. But they still have, this sort of basic concept or understanding that was expedited by seeing that this time they're acknowledged. If they were successful in Tahrir Square, it's not because they thought that the Egyptian regime at the time would necessarily listen to them. They got bolder and they stood firm when they knew the whole world was monitoring them and was watching them and was aware of what they were doing. And they did not be educated. What they needed is to be informed or inform you. So in a way, I would say, by all means education, but think also in terms of constant communication. Because communication is immediate. Education takes a while to sink in.
I was just wondering what you thought of why your father was overthrown, and if there were things that you disagreed with.
Well, if I want to go back to that era, and as they say, hindsight is 20/20. It's always easy to go back and say, well, I would have done this way, that way. And in the heat of the moment, some decisions had to be made. Whether they were correct or not, one could analyze and see where it went right, where it went wrong. If I were to say, what is my most critical observation of what wasn't done in the time was there was an inconsistency between the vision and the implementation. My father had this vision to modernize the country, to educate the people. He wanted to achieve a country that would soon be ready for a Western-style democracy. But if this was the vision, and everything he did was consistent with that vision, but it was never explained or it was never implemented in the best way possible, because it's very simple. Once you start educating people, what do you think is going to happen? Clearly, people want to have more participation. They want to have more involvement. If you look at Iran back then, virtually every aspect of freedom in Iran existed. The only point that was debatable or arguable was there enough political freedom in the form of political parties and what have you. Now keep in mind that we're talking about the Cold War era, where Iran was constantly being undermined by elements within the leftist Marxist ideology, very much in line with Moscow trying to satellize the whole country into the Soviet orbit. And a lot of the conflict was with those forces. In terms of being politically organized, those groups were much better organized than any other political group in Iran. There was a disparity of strength and organization because there was a lot of money behind those communist forces, whereas there was not much means for other liberal groups in the country. It's a little bit like in Egypt, except for this time it was not the Marxists so much as it was the Islamic, Muslim Brotherhood, for instance. I'm not trying to justify anything, I'm just trying to explain to you what was the reason why there was a restriction in political freedom. Because that disparity would have all of a sudden tipped the balance one way. The problem was not that. The problem was if you don't allocate part of your policy of reforms to be not just on the economic side, but also in the political side, while you have taken away traditional institutions that were an obstacle to progress, such as, for instance, curbing the degree of influence that the clerics had, or, for instance, this issue of emancipation and liberties, but not replacing all the institutions with new ones and concentrate just as much time for it as you do on the economic program, you will ultimately reach a point that all of a sudden people have much more demand to participate, and yet you haven't provided the environment for it. So it becomes a political crisis. This political crisis could be taken advantage of by some opportunists, which is exactly what happened in 1979. Because if you ask any of the people who at the time were acting against my father's regime, if you ask them today, did you have the result that you have achieved in mind? They say, absolutely not. That's not what we were thinking. That's not what we wanted. Was it reformable? Of course it was. But the time that the political crisis surfaced in Iran, it was too late, in my view, to deal with it. Even though my father at the time did offer to the intelligentsia that was asking for these major reforms, very well, let's sit at the table and discuss it. The trouble is that at the time, the revolutionaries did nothing in terms of reforming the system. They were thinking in terms of completely getting rid of the system, as I said, not knowing what the alternative would be. And unfortunately, we are where we are today. So my criticism of that era was that there was not enough effort made into investing in a process whereby sooner or later society will demand far more participation. And that requires enough people who have the political savvy or know-how to guide society through that process. The kind of intellectuals and thinkers that countries need at the time of major political changes or adjustments, if you will. I think we produced far too many technocrats and bureaucrats as we did necessarily true political thinkers. And I don't mean philosophers, I mean people who are actually at the level of being great statesmen. People who have the ability to guide society and lead them, not from the pulpit of a university or not necessarily as a journalist, but people who are out there in the scene. That disparity was quite obvious. And when the crisis occurred and we had to look around and see, well, who can come and save the day, we simply didn't have enough of those. And that's all of a sudden how it took the turn that it did. So everybody was dumbfounded. The regime failed at it. The liberal intellectuals of yesteryear failed to understand really what the problem was. And as a result, it was, I think, a series of different failure to address the problem. And I don't think it would be fair to pin it only on my father, but it was also part, his inability to, beyond his vision, actually implement it the way it could have been done. Too much authority and decision was concentrated in one man at the end of the day, and as a result, nobody else wanted to take the responsibility, and it became basically a one-man show at the very end. So obviously that's a problem, because it's against the grain of everything you were hoping to achieve. And that's really the criticism that I have.
If you look at the revolution, for Egyptian people, I would have thought Iran would have been the blueprint, you know, in terms of if this is going to happen, we need something in place, otherwise Iran, and that's my first observation with Egypt, this is Iran all over again, 1979. I mean, what lessons are there to be learned for these Arab countries who are trying to find a new way, and for these countries like Saudi Arabia who are in a very, you know, dubious situation? I mean, can they learn anything from Iran, I guess, in 79?
I think we can put in one general category all the secular democrats of all of these respective countries in one pot. They might have some minor differences of opinion. Somebody might be a liberal democrat, the other one could be a social democrat, you know, in terms of being more to the left or more to the right or to the center of the political equation. But categorically, as secular democrats, they have a commonality of purpose and interest in any of these countries. What I would say is that, well, first of all, before I say this, let me offer you this analysis. Again, I go back to the era of the Cold War. Many Western governments, oddly enough, Western democracies, had to, in containing and dealing with the Soviet threat, deal with or support many non-democratic regimes in many places of the world. Because the first priority was to make sure that communist Russia does not take over and lead our world to the direction it wanted to take it. What I'm trying to say is that maybe in terms of realpolitik, they would have justified that if we had to support some governments in the region, at least until the Soviet Union collapsed, you could argue that it might have been necessary. Not desirable, but necessary. However, my point is, once the Soviet Union collapsed, take Egypt, 1985. Okay? That's pretty much around the time that the Soviet Union pretty much ceased to exist. You could argue that up to that point, if, let's say, the United States as a country was supportive of the various Egyptian regimes or governments, and by the way, there were not too many, oddly enough, most of these countries in the past 50 years have gone through 2 or at best maybe 3 heads of state altogether. That by itself should raise a lot of eyebrows, but it's one of the facts of yesteryear. So let's say we had Gamal Abdel Nasser, who in the 50s led a revolution in Egypt. He was followed by Anwar Sadat, and then his vice president, who became President Mubarak. So in close to 70 years, we had 3 people for the entire almost century of a country like Egypt. All right. So we come to 1985. What happens then? The very same countries who were supportive of, let's say, I'm using Egypt as an example because it was the question. They could have said, now, from now on, certain things have to change. There's no longer an excuse to hide behind the fact that, well, we cannot liberalize now because it will destabilize the country. Because you no longer had that Soviet threat or any elements that were backed or influenced by the Soviets. Whether it's Cairo or Baghdad or Damascus or what have you. I would have then said, whether you're French or British or American or any government dealing with Egypt, we will help you enable civil society, political parties, political institutions to gradually form. And once there's enough parity that you have sufficient amount of various blocks that are represented by people's preferences through a political party, for instance, then be able to truly conduct free elections, which, after all, in all working democracies, it's a matter of various parties, you know, nominating their candidates, and they form a government, and life goes on. Why is it that for 30 years, since 1985, nothing changed vis-à-vis Egypt. So why shouldn't we not be surprised that in 2010, when there is such a major change, and because nothing was done between 1985 to 2010 to change the status quo, we'll be faced with this sudden void, because now he has been so unpopular that it's no longer tenable to keep him in power. You force him down, he leaves, and then you have this. Or Tunisia, or Syria, or God knows how many other countries. The problem is not just dealing with something that is undesired. If we don't prepare the stage for something that can replace it, we're missing the whole point. And what's even worse is that some governments now say, oh, you know what, we're afraid that something that could come instead could even become worse. And they use it as an excuse to somehow maintain the status quo. And again, I'm saying that if, as of now, it's never too late to start. As of now, if the idea is, whether it's in Iran or in Syria or in Egypt or any of these countries that are in dire need of major changes politically, it's not by arguing with the leadership. Because even if they were to agree with you, they say, well, we don't have the instances. You want us to step aside and have free elections? What do you think is going to happen? A bunch of hoodlums are going to come and feel the point, and God knows what they will take the country to. Help them, if they require help, to do that. At least countries that are allies of these Western democracies, provided that they agree to commit to it. And if they don't, then it's a sign that they want to hang on to power no matter what, at which point you are forced to talk to the people of those nations, say, if your leadership is not willing to cooperate, we will help you to get rid of them and we'll cooperate with you. That's a classic case of what is happening in the case of Iran today. What I'm trying to say to the world is, take the example of Iran. Iranians want to have a democratic system, are quite capable of forming this institution if you help them. Even under the circumstances where this regime will not allow any kind of freedom, at least they can mentally prepare for it. You can gear up for it. So if tomorrow the change happens, there's something that is ready to step in and fill the void. In fact, it will make the job for someone like myself much easier, because all I'm doing right now, and in fact I forgot to mention that to you, the campaign that I'm leading at this stage of the game is one that is very simple and finite in terms of its goal and mission. I am putting together a national council of Iranians in view of the fact that it cannot form inside the country as a first base outside the country. This national council has as a goal and sole mission a campaign to demand our sovereign rights as Iranian citizens to be able to conduct free and fair elections in Iran, as described by article, I think it's 21 of the Declaration of Human Rights and the Interparliamentary Council, which define exactly what is the meaning of free elections and the circumstances that had to exist. There are two possibilities. Either the clerical regime sort of caves in and accepts to voluntarily allow for this to happen, which it won't. And if it doesn't, then what can be done? If they're not going to voluntarily leave the scene, you have to help the people overcome them. As I said, as an option to having war and chaos and conflict and what have you. Because the status quo obviously is not in the interest of the people, nor is it in your interest from the outside looking in. So scenarios might be slightly different depending on what country you're dealing with. Certainly in Egypt, you don't have a totalitarian system that's trying to export an ideology, although they are ideologically based somehow, but they are certainly not that the regime in Iran trying to export its vision. Iran is very different. Syria is very different. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all policy. Each country has to be analyzed and examined and treated in a particular way. You can't just broad brush all of them in the same way. But the commonality that would exist in all of these countries, no matter what, is how do you help such civil institutions to come into play so that ultimately the people of those nations, once liberated, have the ability to be represented through political organizations that are in charge of conducting elections in order to form this or that government. That's at the end of the day. Because you don't debate every day the content of a constitution. I think you draft a constitution, all the values and principles that are in there, but the real exercise of the day, long after the dust settles and the form is finally decided by referendum or the majority vote or what have you, is how to conduct elections. That's how governments are formed. And if these institutions are not in place, it doesn't matter what you do, you will never achieve that stage. That's the missing ingredient. Now, in some cases, it's been long overdue. And that's why I think that part of the effort should be not just to exercise diplomacy at the top of current representatives, whether they are complying or non-complying. Part of this dialogue has to be extended beyond the existing regimes or governments in place. And that has been, oddly enough, in my view, the missing ingredients, particularly when it comes to Iran. In 34 years and counting, most of the dialogue that foreign governments have had has been limited to the current regime and its representatives. There has never been, up to this day, any direct official dialogue with anyone representing the secular democratic opposition to the regime, inside or outside. Now that should be kind of concern to all of you. How could we not be in dialogue with the opposition? Have we only be talking to Khamenei or Ahmadinejad who say, oh, by the way, let's wipe up Israel off the map? No wonder they want to say, at some point we might have to push the button and fire a missile, because nothing else is getting done. On the other hand, if there was going to be a dialogue with the democratic forces, with an intent to actually help and invest, you want to have a democratic result, you have to invest in democracy and its process. That's why I was saying education is important, but it's not enough. You have to do more than just educate people. You have to also empower them. I use the term empowerment a lot in my discussions. Empowerment can be in the form of information, financial support, technological abilities, what have you. In other words, it's giving more tools and equipment for people to, at the end of the day, be able to achieve their goals or ambitions.
Your Majesty, I was just wondering if you still had supporters, or there's people in Iran who still wanted your family to run the country, or do you have supporters back in Iran still, or is the regime kind of...
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount of support, and I'm not saying this because it sounds self-serving, but because it's a fact. And in fact, I think a lot of Iranians, particularly younger generation, when they follow what I suggest and what I propose, they have, I think, a very direct way of assessing me for what I stand, which doesn't have to do much with my genetics, but mostly because of my opinions and beliefs. Because I am my own man, and I therefore stand on my own ground, and I therefore propose a suggestion, a choice that they can make among different choices. And what I propose to them is the quickest path with the least cost possible to our society to achieve that change. And I've told them, and I still say it, I said, I'm not in this for myself. Doesn't matter what happens to me, I'll be just as happy to be a regular citizen one day in Iran serving my country. And if I'm chosen to represent them at a much higher office and level, it will be the greatest honor that you can bestow an individual. But I'm not in this for myself. I'm in this because I think Iran deserves better. Iran deserves the respect it once had, what Iranians could travel the world with an Iranian passport and be respected by any immigration officer as they entered, as opposed to be treated as potential terrorists just because this regime has given our country and our citizens a bad name. And people are ashamed to even admit they are Iranians in this day and age. We deserve better than having someone like Ahmadinejad represent our country. When he walks in the UN, half of the delegates leave that room, as opposed to stand there and listen as a country that is out there to contribute to the world. I think Iran can be a country that can certainly bring a lot of change in the region, have proven it before, potentially, and they deserve better than what they've got. It's a country that has a history and a culture that values human life, who is today represented about an ideology that celebrates martyrdom more than life. That's not us. That's not Iran. So it doesn't matter what happens to me. I simply say Iran deserves better. And my job is to try and make sure that the way they achieve that is with the path of least pain and suffering and cost. There are other options. I don't deny that. but are they necessarily better options or less costly options? That's what I challenge. So what I propose is very clear, is very concise. I'm not imposing a thought, I'm just proposing it. The implementation of that choice is entirely up to them. I think it's a day and age where the true function of leadership is to equip people with the ability to think and decide for themselves. I would have succeeded as a leader if at the end of the day I have enabled a fellow compatriot with enough means that he doesn't have to depend on me to make a decision. I would have failed as a leader if at the end of the day they come to me for an answer or a decision. That's my way of thinking, that's my style of leadership, and therefore I think it's very different than whatever they've been accustomed to in the past, whether it's from a royal family or some other guy. Part of the solution that I offer to decrease the cost and hardship in terms of human lives is to minimize any kind of resistance the regime can show by using force, by giving elements that are today entrapped in this regime and want out the guarantee of survival beyond this regime. In other words, if you're a member of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, or the Basij, which are the irregulars that are recruited into some form of a armed, that are in charge of basically repressing people on the street, if they know that they need not fear the future, that they will have a place in society, that society will embrace them and forgive them and let them back in, as opposed to thinking that if this regime goes, they go down with it and they have no hope for the future, guess what's going to happen? They're going to fight to the bitter end. It's a little bit like what you see with Bashar Assad and his immediate basis of support. So part of my campaign strategy is not just to suggest a secular democratic alternative and what have you, and the most obvious in order to get to democracy and human rights and what have you, but it's also to enable a process whereby we could have amnesty, we could have national reconciliation. Because once the elements that the regime thinks it can count on in order to stay in power and repress people are no longer there to support them, guess what's going to happen? There might be a few left, but there's a complete tip in the balance. That's also part of the message. So I've been very much against scenarios of violent change, not just in Iran, but anywhere else. Because violence begets violence at the end of the day. And I don't think that in many cases the means justify the ends. Or the end in this case will justify this kind of means. Because we see an example. Yes, there's been violent changes both in Afghanistan and Iraq. But has there been a permanent solution to the problem? No. Does it need to happen in a country like Iran? Should Israel tomorrow decide to actually launch a military strike on Iran? Or for that matter, impregnate the world in following suit, and then we have a major mess on our hand? And will it solve the problem? No. Which is why I'm standing here pleading with people like yourselves and the world of saying there's a better way of achieving a result without having to go the path that will lead to more violence and more bloodshed, and certainly not a scenario which will put an end to the cycle of revenge and killing. So these are my red lines. It's all a choice, my friend. At the end of the day, you offer a choice. People have to decide between this or that. You cannot be responsible more than what you believe and you present. You cannot be responsible for other people's actions. Everybody have to take responsibility for their own actions. So I'm trying to take responsibility in my own actions by not just saying things, but by deed, show that they have a way out, and at the end, it's all about them. It's not about me. So I think that's what they understand, and that's why, to answer your question, I think that I'm getting more and more recognition and support from my fellow compatriots inside. Some who may first know me in a nostalgic sense, tying me to the past, but a lot of people who are rediscovering me for who I really am and how I think. And that's very important, and I must admit that had it not been for today's technology, my job would have been much harder to convey that. But judging by the amount of people who are following me on Facebook or read my website and the statistics, it's quite telling that it's on the up, and there's more talk about it back home. So that's very encouraging to me anyway.
On behalf of all of us at Think Global School, I would like to express profound gratitude for this amazing opportunity today that you've cordially invited us to. It's not often that we get the opportunity to actually listen, yet even more, to question somebody who is so much a part of history and also contemporary world experiences. And listening to what you were saying this afternoon, in my mind, there were many, many connections that you alluded to that have been building up over the course of the time when we were in Bhutan, and most recently in Boston and in Washington. In particular, you emphasized the fact that we as individuals cannot be passive, that we need to be proactive, that we need to be actually thinking of doing something, that with our technology and with our intellect and with our courage, we can, must make a difference in the world. And I think from the many answers that you gave this afternoon to the questions that were, I thought, quite articulately framed, what came out time after time after time again was not the repression of a regime, but the fortitude, the emotional integrity of individual people who collectively can make a difference. And one of the core values of Think Global School is really that resilience to make change into the future. So I want to thank you for highlighting for us that which is important both for us and for everybody around the world. We would like to stay in contact with you to remain a part of your journey, as we hope you'll be a part of our journey, as we hope in time most people will feel that we're all on the same journey, that towards peace and prosperity and equality for everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.